What's it like when one of your friends on death row is led away to be executed?
You spend, years and years and months and hours of every day with a person, and he eventually comes by one day and is like, yeah, I gotta go, man. And when he leaves and turns his back and walks down them steps, he ain't coming back.
Many people disagree with the death sentence. Many countries have done away with it, but some still use it for the worst crimes. However, death row is not the same in every country. Each country has its own rules, methods, and stories that show how punishment and justice are carried out. Let's take a closer look at what life is like on death row around the world, from the privacy of China to the public executions in Saudi Arabia. Let us count down the countries that still practice this way of punishing criminals. USA. In the past, U.S. killings happened pretty quickly after the sentence was given, but over time, legal protections and review processes grew to try to stop people from being wrongfully convicted. These many levels of review can now make the process take decades. On average, it takes about 20 years. This leaves prisoners in a strange limbo state. Take the case of Anthony Ray Hinton. In Alabama, he was put on death row for almost 30 years for a crime he didn't do. He wasn't freed until 2015, after years of court battles and new proof showing he wasn't guilty. Stories like his show not only why the appeals process is so long, but also what an unbearable toll it takes on the people who are involved. Inmates on death row have a hard time. Most prisoners are locked up in small rooms for 23 hours a day, with little to do and no one to talk to. Being alone for so long is very hard on the mind. Some prisoners have been found not guilty after years of being held in these conditions, showing the dangers of such a harsh sentence. In addition, the United States is unique because each state has its own rules about life sentences. For example, Texas is known for having more killings than any other state. In contrast, states like California have a lot of people on death row, but rarely carry out the sentence. Instead, prisoners in those states are more likely to die of natural causes. In the United States, the ways people are put to death have changed over time. In many places, lethal injection is now the main way to kill someone, and it is seen as a humane choice. But there have been problems with it, like bad killings where the drugs didn't work right and caused a lot of pain. In some places, other ways are still perfectly legal. Some states, like Utah, Oklahoma, and South Carolina, still use the gas chamber, firing squads, hanging, and electrocution, though not very often. There are often arguments about whether or not these methods are moral and effective. Recently, more and more people have said bad things about the practice. A number of states have done away with the death sentence completely, and others are looking at how it can be used again. It's still not clear what will happen with the death penalty in the US because of concerns about fairness, racial bias, and wrong judgments. But US is probably the mildest when it comes to death penalty. Stay tuned to see some really hardcore examples. China. China's system for the death sentence is very different from the US system, which takes a long time and gets a lot of attention. China's killings are known for being quick and secretive, and there are more of them than in any other country. China is thought to put more people to death each year than the rest of the world put together, though the exact numbers are kept secret. The speed of the process is one big difference. People in China who are found guilty of murder, stealing, or corruption can be put to death within months or even weeks of their sentence. The main reason for this is that appeals are restricted and quick answers are preferred over long court battles. Even when someone is facing the death sentence, trials are usually short, and the person charged may confess under pressure or without a lawyer. China has also changed the ways people are put to death. In the past, people were put to death by shooting squad, which is still done in some situations. But deadly injection is said to be becoming more popular because it is seen as more humane. Mobile execution cars, which are basically trucks that can give fatal injections, are one of the scariest parts of China's system. With these cars, the government can carry out killings quickly and quietly in different areas. One controversial thing about China's death sentence is that it can be used for acts that aren't violent. Some well-known cases, like the one of Lai Xiaomin, a former bank employee who was put to death in 2021 for cheating and bribery, show how China uses the death sentence as a way to keep the people in line and scare them away. When these killings are shown in state-run media, they are often used as dramatic threats. For those on death row, conditions are tough. Inmates typically face strict confinement, and their families are often kept in the dark about the timing or even the location of the execution. The lack of transparency extends to the appeals process, leaving little room for legal or public scrutiny. Despite growing international pressure to reduce its use of the death penalty, China continues to defend it as a necessary deterrent. The system reflects the country's broader emphasis on order, control, and swift justice, but it also raises serious questions about fairness and human rights in a system where secrecy and efficiency take precedence over transparency and reform. Iran. Iran's justice system is based on the death sentence, which is a very important part of it. The country is known for routinely putting people to death for a wide range of crimes, many of which go beyond the international standard of only punishing the most serious offenses. The way that people are put to death in Iran is one of the most shocking things about their system. Some people hang them, which is most common. This is often done in public places to scare people away, like town parks. They hang people in public to send a message, and even kids can see them. They are seen as important by the government to keep society in order, but many human rights groups have spoken out against them for being cruel in public. People are also worried about how fair Iran's court system is. Those who are charged with drug crimes or political dissent are usually found guilty right away and given the death sentence. Folks who are being charged often can't get good lawyers, and they might be beaten or made to say something. This has led to terrible things, like the execution of wrestler Navid Afkari in 2020, even though there were protests all over the world and claims that he admitted while being tortured. How the country handles drug-related crimes has caused a lot of debate. Before the changes that happened in 2017, having or selling small amounts of drugs could get you killed. These changes have cut down on killings for drug crimes, but they haven't stopped them completely. Iran is still one of the world's top executioners. In Iran, being on death row is a mix of fear and hopelessness. Prisoners often have to deal with harsh conditions and don't have much touch with the outside world. Families are sometimes only told a few hours before a death sentence is carried out, and sometimes they may not even be told until after the fact. The Iranian government says that the death penalty is a tool for justice and social order, but other countries have spoken out against its use. Saudi Arabia. Sharia law, also known as Islamic law, is at the heart of Saudi Arabia's legal system and the death sentence. Because of this, the death penalty is used for many crimes. What makes Saudi Arabia unique is that it relies on strict readings of religious law and punishes people in very public places. In Saudi Arabia, the most usual way to kill someone is to cut off their head with a sword. This hasn't changed much over the centuries. As a warning to others, executions are often done in public, like in front of churches after Friday prayers. In some situations, the bodies of people who have been executed are put on display in public to scare people even more. For people from outside the country, this way may seem old-fashioned, but it shows how much they value tradition and the idea that public punishments work as a deterrent. The judicial process in Saudi Arabia has been criticized for its lack of transparency and fairness. Trials are often quick, and defendants may not always have access to adequate legal representation. In some cases, confessions obtained under torture or coercion have been used to convict individuals. High-profile cases, such as that of Ali al-Nimr, who was sentenced to death for participating in protests as a teenager, highlight the system's harshness and the risks of political and social dissent. The Saudi government says that the death penalty is important to keep the peace and follow Islamic law. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made changes that have cut down on the use of the death sentence for minors and some nonviolent crimes. This could mean that the death penalty is used differently in the future. Egypt. There is the death penalty in Egypt's strong legal system. This punishment is often used for both serious crimes and to keep the government in check. In Egypt, the death penalty is used a lot during political protests. The primary method of execution is by hanging, used for both civilian and military prisoners. People often say that trials that end in the death penalty are too quick and don't follow due process, especially when the case is political. People in these cases are often accused of terrorism or activities against the government. They may be journalists, activists, or members of resistance groups. One famous example is when 683 people were all given the death penalty in 2014 for protesting against the government. Many of these sentences were later shortened or thrown out. but the original verdicts showed how harshly Egypt punishes people who speak out against the government. Mahmoud Abu Zaid, a photographer who was told he would die for recording a violent crackdown on a protest, is another well-known case. The world learned about his case because it showed how the death penalty can be used to silence free speech. Life on death row in Egypt is marked by overcrowded prisons and harsh conditions. Inmates often endure long periods of uncertainty, as death sentences must be ratified by the Grand Mufti, Egypt's top religious authority, before being carried out. However, this step is largely symbolic, as the Mufti rarely overturns court decisions. Egypt says that its use of the death sentence is necessary to keep people safe and stop terrorism, but this has been widely criticized. Concerns about forced admissions, unfair trials, and the targeting of political opponents have made people wonder what the real goal of these executions was. Singapore. Singapore uses the death sentence because it has strict laws and is very strict about enforcing them. Known for being one of the safest countries in the world, a big part of it is because of their tough stance on crime, including the use of capital punishment. Unlike many countries, Singapore makes no apologies for its policy, arguing that the death penalty is an essential deterrent. Executions in Singapore are carried out by hanging, which is a pretty quick process compared to other places in the world. The death sentence is most often used for murder and drug dealing. One thing that makes Singapore stand out is that some sins must be punished with death. For example, selling more than a certain amount of drugs like methamphetamine or heroin instantly leads to death, leaving the judge with little room to make decisions. As a result, cases like the one of Nagenthran Darmalingam, a Malaysian man who was put to death in 2022 despite calls for his release around the world, have become controversial. As Nagenthran was diagnosed with an intellectual disability, his case was criticized around the world. Supporters said that because of his mental capacity, he should not have been put to death. Even so, Singapore's government said that the term was legal under its own rules. Trials in Singapore are known for being thorough, but critics argue that the system offers limited flexibility, especially in cases involving mandatory death sentences. The state's firm stance on drug offenses, in particular, has faced backlash from human rights groups who question the morality and effectiveness of executing non-violent offenders. For those on death row, life is a strict and regimented existence. The prisoners are locked up in small rooms and don't have much touch with the outside world. Singapore says that the fact that it is known as a clean, safe, and orderly country is a big reason why it has low crime rates, but some critics say that it doesn't give much room for kindness or rehabilitation. Singapore still has one of the toughest laws in the world when it comes to the death penalty, no matter if it is seen as a necessary tool or a harsh holdover from the past. Iraq. The decades of war, political instability, and attempts to fight terrorists have made the death sentence a big part of the justice system in Iraq. A lot of different crimes are punishable by death. A lot of people are interested in and critical of Iraq's use of the death sentence, especially its quick hearings and high execution rate. Executions in Iraq are carried out by hanging, and the process often takes place in secrecy. While the country abolished the death penalty briefly after the US-led invasion in 2003, it was reinstated in 2005 as part of efforts to address escalating violence and insurgency. Since then, it has become a common response to terrorism and violent crime. The killing of Saddam Hussein in 2006 was one of the most controversial times in modern Iraq's use of the death sentence. His hanging, which was shown in part on TV, was a sign of the end of his rule, but also showed how controversial the death penalty is in a country that is still trying to get back on its feet after years of war and dictatorship. Iraqi jails are very crowded and don't have many tools for people on death row. Before they are put to death, prisoners often have to wait a long time and live in bad conditions without knowing what will happen to them. Families are rarely told ahead of time about killings, which makes the emotional toll on loved ones even higher. The Iraqi government says that the death penalty is important to keep the country safe because it is still dealing with terrorism and violence between different religious groups. The United Nations and other foreign groups have, however, repeatedly asked Iraq to stop executing people, citing worries about fair trials and violations of human rights. Kuwait. When it comes to the death sentence, Kuwait has a mix of old-fashioned law and modern government. The country is small, but it has a strict attitude to the death sentence. People are put to death as a way to keep the peace and uphold justice. In Kuwait, hanging is the main way people are put to death, and it only happens in certain places. In contrast to some of its neighbors, Kuwait doesn't usually carry out killings in public, but they are still very public events. Kuwait's laws are a mix of Islamic law, Sharia, and parts of civil and criminal rules. This has an effect on how death sentence cases are treated, with a strong focus on justice and getting revenge. As an example, the family of the murder victim is very important in these situations. Qisas, retaliation, says that they can demand the death sentence, take money as payment, diya, or forgive the person who did the wrong. This gives the families of victims some control over how these cases turn out. Controversial executions have occasionally put Kuwait in the international spotlight. For example, in 2017, 7 people, some of whom were from other countries, were put to death in a single day. These cases brought attention to the country's zero-tolerance policy for major crimes. Life on death row in Kuwait is less well known than in other countries, but people who are on death row usually have to wait a long time before they are executed. Delays are often caused by the complaints process and the fact that a death sentence needs to be approved by the emir, who is the leader of Kuwait, before it can be carried out. Somalia. Somalia's use of the death penalty is shaped by its unique challenges as a nation plagued by decades of conflict, political instability, and lawlessness. In this environment, capital punishment is frequently used for crimes such as murder and espionage. In Somalia, people are put to death by shooting squad, and the events are often seen by many people. In a country with weak central government, public killings are a way to show power and keep people from breaking the law. Most of the time, these killings happen quickly, especially when military judges are in charge of terrorism cases. People who are accused of being part of the terrorist group Al-Shabaab are often put to death after short trials in military courts that are not open or follow due process. Somalia's legal system is a complex mix of customary law, Sharia law, and remnants of colonial legal codes. This patchwork system often leads to variations in how justice is administered, depending on the region and authority in control. One notable case occurred in 2017, when a Somali military court sentenced and executed a soldier who had killed a government minister. The case was highly publicized, showcasing the government's efforts to assert its authority and uphold the rule of law. South Sudan. As the world's youngest nation, South Sudan is still having trouble building a justice system that works in a country with unstable politics, ongoing war, and poor infrastructure. As part of its laws, the death sentence is used for murder, treason, and severe robbery, among other crimes. The use of the death penalty is, however, a very controversial topic because the system is flawed and not very clear. People are put to death by hanging, and the process is often kept secret. A lot of people on death row don't have many lawyers to help them during their cases, which are often attacked for not being fair by international standards. One of the most controversial things about South Sudan's death sentence is that it can be used on children. International law says that children can't be put to death. But there have been stories of children being put to death in South Sudan because records weren't kept properly, or there were no birth papers to prove their age. In one case, a 16-year-old boy was put to death in 2021, which was strongly criticized by human rights groups. Things are very bad for people in South Sudan who are on death row. Prisons are too busy, not well taken care of, and lack simple amenities. Inmates who are going to be put to death often have to wait a long time. South Sudan is trying to create the rule of law, and the death penalty is a controversial problem in that process. Reform supporters say that the country's justice system needs major changes before it can properly hand down such an unchangeable sentence. But the government says that the death penalty is necessary as a deterrent, especially in a country that is still healing from years of civil war and high crime. And we have come to the end of this video. Tell us what you think of the death penalty and how it's used around the world. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.